Good afternoon, and I hope you're all well fed, both mentally and physically, by the ideas and the food that you acquired. We are now here together in the next plenary session with a keynote by Professor Marušić, who is, and I want to make sure I get this right, Professor of Anatomy and Chair of the Department of Research in Biomedicine and Health at the University of Split Medical School in Split, Croatia. And she's also an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh. I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And before we start, I was in a session about statistics before, and I want to make a disclaimer. I'm a medical doctor, and you know that they are afraid of statisticians, so I will declare a bias here because I will present a very biased and kind of personal view of research and actually mostly on what we did in studying the peer review process in journals and funding agencies. I was asked yesterday how I come from medicine and anatomy into this, and that's via being a journal of global health. And you may think that medicine doesn't have much to do with the social sciences, but I like then to quote Virchow, who was a founder of physiology and pathophysiology in medicine, who said, he was also a politician, who said that medicine is a social science and that politics is just medicine on a grander scale. So we kind of think that we can meddle into other sciences, and especially I like the motto of your university, understanding science, and this is, I think, what we also do in meta-research, and that is understanding science and in these processes. So actually I was drawn to this field of research from my basic biomedical laboratory research on transgenic mice and bone and immune system by becoming an editor of a journal. That was almost 30 years ago. And that kind of, as a scientist, when you get into that field, you also want to do research. And this is why I'm now studying mostly research integrity and also some kind of research on research. What I'm going to talk about, you all know probably a lot about peer review, but we have to be aware that peer review may be different between disciplines, maybe what you have in the social science and humanities is a little bit different than what we have in medicine. So I'm just going to talk about a little bit of types of peer review, also about a history, because it's very important that you learn the enemy, a lot about enemy that you study, and also what opportunities and challenges we have in studying peer review, both in journal articles and also of grant proposals. So when we look at peer review, you can take a definition from Merriam-Webster dictionary, you know, evaluating something that is proposed by one or more experts in the field, and it kind of fits into the Merton's norms of kind of organized skepticism. But most of us, and this is an illustration from one of the peer review conferences that was organized by one of the leading journals in medicine, JAMA, it's a black box, you know, you send your paper, and from there you either have it published or most often rejected. And we know that in some journals the rejection is really high. For example, in most of the kind of the big five, the five largest journals in biomedicine, the acceptance of research papers is around 1%. And they have more than 10,000 submissions per year. So it's really a lot of papers get rejected. So now this is like the usual, what happens in a black box. You, especially now with the online submission systems, the authors know much more about what is happening in this black box that we used to know now, before. Maybe that's one of the topics that can be studied, you know, how this process goes and what happens in online environment. But it's really good to know about the history of peer review. And this is an article that I really suggest to you to read. It's on F1000 Research, written by John Tennant and the group about the history of peer review. And what is interesting is that the peer review didn't start with the journals. We know that the first journals were published more than 350 years ago. In 1665, one in France and one in UK. This is Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in London. But peer review, if you look at it, peer review comes late. Only in the beginning of the 18th century, where actually the Royal Society of Edinburgh introduces society members peer review. And when you look at kind of modern journals, what you see, for example, is that Nature introduced peer review only in the 1950s. So peer review is not something that is very old. You can also, and that's kind of the reason why people didn't understand peer review in the early years. So it's not surprising that an editor of a journal got a response like this. We, Mr. Rose and I, have sent you a manuscript to be published, not to be sent out to some other people who are anyway wrong in what they say. So we decide that we take our paper and publish it somewhere. Nothing surprising, but it was Albert Einstein who got his paper rejected in Physics Reviews B and wasn't satisfied that his paper was peer-reviewed. So peer review is relatively new thing in research evaluation. And you can look at it now. For us in medicine, PubMed is a database that we look at because it's the largest database of biomedical research with now more than 30 million articles that you search. And is also has more than 6,000 journals indexed in there. And we look at when peer review emerged as a topic. So PubMed has this medical subject heading, which is a directory, hierarchical directory, how they index their papers. Peer review emerged in 71, including peer review also of healthcare or whatever. And peer review of research was introduced in 1994. Which is really quite late. So this concept of peer review, when we look at the long history of research, is something that is quite new. And now what we have from that beginning of 18th century to now, we have all kinds of peer review. Some of you know all of them, but some of you may not, so I'm going to go quickly through these types of peer review. Editors cannot be stopped talking about peer review anyway, so single-blind, double-blind, consultative, results-free or results-masked, open peer review, post-publication peer review. So single-blind peer review is very common in life sciences and actually in medicine, especially clinical medicine. It's the authors do not know the identity of the reviewer, whereas reviewers know the identity of the authors. And research shows, for example, that authors think they know who the reviewers were, but actually they cannot guess the reviewers, whereas reviewers can guess the authors' names even if you try to anonymize the manuscripts. It's sometimes, especially in some small fields of research, it's very easy to guess the identity of the author. Double-blind review is more common in social sciences and humanities. Recently, we had a whole meeting of editors together with the European Commission discussing the impact of GDPR, so personal data protection regulation, on journals, because we had editors of journals claiming that it can do only blind peer review, double-blind peer review, because it's then only then satisfies the GDPR requirements, which is not true. So, but then again, you have to have a whole structure in journals how to deal with the GDPR and the use of personal data that we get from authors in journals. So quite complicated. And nowadays, some of the journals in life sciences also offer double-blind peer review to authors, like Nature. There was a famous Nature experiment where they offered blind peer review. But then again, the result shows, I think, that only 20% of the people opted for double-blind peer review. And when they looked at it, at the success of these papers, most of the papers that wanted blind peer review were rejected. And what they found out is that big authors don't want to go for a blind peer review, whereas small authors, from outside of the scientific mainstream, want to be blindly peer reviewed in Nature, which also tells you a little bit about the science and publication efforts that we have. Consultative peer review is something that is like a panel. So this is, it was introduced by eLife, which is a rather new journal in biomedical sciences and natural sciences, where they actually journals organize discussion. It's a remote discussion, but it's a discussion with the journal, and what is sent back to authors is not reviewers' comments, but kind of a panel, joint panel recommendations and comments to the journal. Quite interesting procedure. And then you have what is called results-free or results-masked peer review, and it's one of the open science initiative of registered reports that now there is a community of 211 journals that actually review papers in 2 steps. First, they want to see methods and introduction to see whether the question is good and whether the methodological approach to the question is valid and robust. And then if it is accepted, then it's kind of promised that when the whole paper is sent, it will stand a good chance that it is accepted in this type of journal. So this is again something that is quite novel. Although the data on the problem of confirmation bias in peer review are quite old. They come from experiments by a psychologist, Mahoney, from 1972, where he showed that reviewers like confirming the current dogma, and his proposal was actually that reviewers, in 72, the reviewers should see the introduction and methods to see whether the paper should go forward to be accepted. And then open peer review is now becoming a standard in biomedicine. So many really very good and prominent medical journals want to have this transparency. In medicine, we are very much for transparency of research, especially of clinical trials, so that we know about the existence of protocols and trials and also about the results, because we have learned hard way that what is promised in a clinical trial is not what you read in a paper, which kind of undermines not only the quality and the validity of these results, but also has ethical problems of what we give back to the patients. So the advantages of an open peer review would be that it ensures transparency, accountability, gives reviewers credit. So some journals publish DOIs with reviews reports so that you can actually cite that as one of your contributions for scientific assessments. Some journals say if you want to sign your name, sign it. Actually, in the beginning, when it was introduced, sometimes in 2000, it was thought that open peer review would be better than single-blind review. And there were randomized studies done on this, and where it was actually shown that it doesn't produce better reviews, but at least it's not worse than a single-blind review. And then they opted for transparency. So when we weigh risks and benefits, medical journals thought it would be better to have the benefit of transparency. And you have, again, variety of open peer review, because you can have everything public. You can have that everybody knows who is doing what, but within the journal, and it's not public. You can have that the reports are published, but not the names of the reviewers. So there are different ways of models of open peer review, and this is something that is, again, coming out as a new way of peer review and maybe worth a study in a way. And then this is the newest development, where you have a formal review of a paper after it's published. So we have informal peer review. You have comments. You have some papers like BMJ that have rapid responses where you can comment on the paper online when it's published. You have social media in natural science and biomedicine. PubPeer is one such where people kind of discuss and criticize published papers and so on. But it can be formal, and 1000 Research was the pioneer in establishing that, where you publish your paper, it receives a DOI, so it's published. You take the credit for publication, and then it goes out for peer review. It's also transparent and open. And at some point, when the revised version that is submitted satisfies the peer reviewers, then it is the version that is the final version, and that is indexed in the end. But what about peer review research? So we have seen that this field is really developing, and it has been studied actually for a long time. And one such example is the International Congresses of Peer Review and Scientific Publication. Before they were called peer review in biomedicine. Now they have enlarged their field to outside of medicine. We started in 1989. And the last one was in 2017, and the next one is in 2 years' time, where every 5 years people get together to discuss research on peer review. So what do we know? We were interested in that from a point of view of meta-research. So my colleagues and I analyzed all the abstracts submitted or presented at the peer review conferences to see how they were published, what happened with them. And for me, what was a surprising finding, that for a community that studies publication bias, which is very important in medicine for evidence synthesis, they don't publish 30% of the abstracts that they present at peer review conferences. And 30% is the non-publication prevalence in medicine, in clinical trials. It's the same in peer review. An important finding is that we don't have robust methodology to test whether peer review works. We don't have many interventional studies, very few randomized controlled trials. Most of the studies are observational. And what is, again, I also think detrimental, and this is going to be discussed or was discussed this morning, is that the funding doesn't actually exist, because it's usually a side project for some researchers, because more than half of these abstract presented didn't cite or didn't have any funding. So this is Drummond Rennie, who is the father of peer review congresses, because we presented this data as kind of an overview before his talk on the past and future of peer review. And then after that, we also wanted to see how it is in other fields, not only in medicine, because what I talked about is the research about biomedical fields. So what we did in a collaboration with the colleagues from Italy and Spain, we looked at records of peer review published from 1969 to 2015 in Scopus. We used Scopus for most of the analysis because it was easier, or the data that we got were better to deal with than we had from Web of Science and PubMed, which we also use to confirm what we get with Scopus. And then what we saw is that you have increase in the number of publications, especially after 2000, which was high. So I think this rate was like the highest was 9%, and here we had more than 15% of the increase. So research on peer review research is increasing. My interpretation of these peaks is that they come almost every 5 years, and it's especially visible in Medline. After peer review congresses, you have publications. And then we also looked at co-authorship network to see this community of scientists that work on peer review. And we looked at 7,071 authors, and we found that they formed almost 2,000 communities when they look at people who cite each other or who author the same papers. And one of these communities had 167 researchers from biomedicine, and most of the communities, so this was the only big community of peer review research in biomedicine, and 98% of other communities of the almost 2,000 had less than 15 researchers in there as co-authors. So the field of peer review research is very fragmented. Also, if you look at co-citation networks, so you see the people who are cited on the same paper in the list of references, then you see again that this field is very fragmented. For example, here in this big blob of biomedical sciences, you had 84 papers out of a large number of papers, and they were responsible for the 33% of the notes, so these pairs of citations. But although they constituted only less than 1% of the cited sources. So the field of peer review is very fragmented, and that's a big problem. Also, when you look at it, this is a study by the group from France, from Cochrane, France, led by Philippe Ravot and Isabelle Boutron, that looked at peer review as an intervention in biomedicine and did a systematic review to see what works as an intervention in peer review. And what they found is, maybe a disappointment to many of you here, training versus usual process of peer reviewer doesn't work. And I especially want to recognize here the work of Mike Callahan, who did a number of studies. These are all randomized trials, so the highest level of methodological approach to test an intervention. Training doesn't work in peer review. If you add a statistical review, that works. So statistical review or statistical editor in a journal works because it makes statistics papers better. If you have checklists, they are good, but they actually don't work. So we have a lot of reporting checklists in medicine, but actually what we need are maybe better studies. These are all 2 studies from the same group. We are not sure that it works. Actually, it doesn't work. And then they also looked at the quality of open peer reviews that you get versus the usual peer review, and the quality increases with the open peer review because people maybe think twice what they're going to write when they have to sign their name or where the report is published. And also where they looked at whether rejection recommendation is more common when you have open peer review or usual process. So rejection is less often recommended in open peer review. And the time spent on open peer review and the usual peer review is the same. So we see that maybe open peer review didn't meet all the expectations that we had, but at least we have some evidence. You can also look, this was another systematic review or more of a kind of a scoping review of modeling, because this is very popular in journals or studies of peer review where you model peer review. And this is a systematic review that looked at 46 articles on different modeling of the processes that happen during peer review or that affect peer review process. And they also identified challenges and gaps, so we have to be aware of the fragmentations, of the biases, of the social influence that is important, and also the lack of empirical data. Very often these modeling studies are not based on actual data on peer review, which is important to have more robust models for peer review. So we come to the conclusion that the peer review research is fragmented. Very often it's a single journal research. So it's questionable how something that works in JAMA, which is at the top, can be generalized on a small scholarly journal from an organization or association somewhere else in the world. We have this problem of non-publication bias. And the problem is that when we look at peer review, we usually study what we see in journals, not with the 99% of the papers that get rejected. So we usually cannot deal with the black box in there. So information on all papers is available only in those journals like F1000 Research that have a post-publication peer review, because everything is documented in the open. So what is the solution for this? And this was thought about in a cost action, which is funding from the European Union to establish networks. And this was a group that looked at the frontiers of peer review called PERI. And what we argued for is that we have to get access to all the data about peer review from a journal, not only what is published. And it took us actually 2 years to sign a contract, and this is a signature from the representative from the Elsevier, Wiley, and Springer Nature, where they gave all the data about the manuscripts from their journals, including the texts of peer review, so all the data about articles that are submitted and the peer review process. And now we are working on this data. And I would invite you to come to the PERI conference on peer review. That's going to be next March in Valencia, Spain. The deadline for submitting abstracts is 2nd of December, so there is enough time, and I think we will be able to share a lot of data, because as I said, we are working now for less than a year on a big batch of data. For example, we are studying some linguistic characteristics of more than almost 600,000 peer review reports from these journals. So I hope that we will get more publishers and more data, because then when we have all the data about peer review, it will be much easier to study that. And just to illustrate how that data can help, I'm just going to talk about an example of such a study done by my colleagues from the PERI cost action. So we know what reviewers think. We know from, I don't know, survey that was done by Elsevier and Sense About Science about what people think about peer review. They did a cross-disciplinary survey, and you see that people like double-blind peer review. We always, from medicine, like to think that people would say that they like open peer review, but almost 80% of them think that double-blind peer review is better. And in a new survey that was done by Wiley, again, on a cross-disciplinary way, you again see that on an ask how likely you are to accept an invitation to review, depending on the type of peer review, many people would accept if it's double-blind peer review, but not if it is open, post-publication, open and published. So people like blind peer review, but this is what they say in a survey, but what they actually do. So this is a study. It was again done on a basis of this collected data for more than one journal in this peer cost action, where they looked at 5 Elsevier journals. They did a pilot where they switched from regular peer review to open peer review with an opt-in. So what they studied is almost 63,000 individual observations, so almost 10,000 submissions and 18,000 completed reviews. So they looked at data. This is the data for these 5 journals before the pilot at different journals, and look what they got, what actually reviewers do. You know, what is their actual action? So when you don't have to publish your name, regardless of whether it's open peer review or undisclosed peer review, people are kind of have the same opinion. But once you publish their name, their opinions differ. So you see lots more accept and minor and major and very little reject. So this also tells us about the behavior of scientists, and maybe that's one of the topics that could be studied and is worth studying by methods of psychology and sociology. But what about peer review grants? I'm going now to finish this with a little bit of evidence that we have from peer review. It's even blacker than the black box, because usually the data from a grant evaluation is not available. Some studies have been done in the United States, Freedom of Information Act. They can get data from the NIH, for example, and so on. But in Europe, it wasn't so much the case. There are small studies on national funders, and Lutz Botsman is one of the researchers that studied a lot. When we look at the evidence that is synthesized about peer review grant, there is a Cochrane systematic review on grant peer review, but it's from 2007. Again, it identifies the same things of not having rigorous methodology, not having enough data to make any conclusions whether peer review of grants work. And this is a recent systematic review of health research funding that was published last year. Again, methodological limitations to study this, variable generalizability to research funders, because it's again on individual systems, and again, data availability. It's very difficult to study things properly if you don't have access to all the data. So I just want to show you 2 examples how you can study grant peer review from outside and from inside. What Sarah said about starting where the light is. And this is a study that we did on the ERC, European Research Council, which is like the frontier research in Europe, the best of the best research, where we looked at the publicly available data. So you have data on who got ERC grants on the web, and we looked at a cohort of 300 reviewers that were divided into 2 types of grants, like a startup grants for young researchers and advanced grants for, the big old people that are already established researchers for new things. And we wanted to see, can you see a difference, whether once you get an ERC grant, which is something that is the dream of every researcher in biomedicine, whether you see an impact. Do they change their publication output? What we got is, of course, when you give money to a young researcher, they increase. So we looked at the difference of what they published before and after. Of course, there are lots of biases there and confounding factors. But actually, when you give money to a young researcher, their publication output measured as the number of publication and number of citations increases. You don't see that in advanced grant recipients because there are these mature recognized researchers that publish anyway a lot, so you don't see that difference. And there was no difference considering this publication output in the money. So the publication in both groups costed the same amount of money. Of course, for young researchers, the number of publications with the last authorship increased because they became the leader of the group. But then we wanted to see, is there any other way except this that we can look at whether something changes? So we looked at co-authorship networks, so how people collaborate. And we saw that for startup grants or young researchers, they increase their network. So there are lots of more people that are collaborating, and what is interesting is that they kind of move into the center of this network and they become most important. But you can even see the change even for advanced grantees. Although they publish the same number of papers, the same number of citations, they are at the kind of saturation level in their career, but still you see changes in different indices of these collaboration or co-authorship networks, where they actually form more communities and start moving backwards, like internet. They're kind of moving the field forward, opening new nodes and new communities, and they are kind of moving a little bit away from the center. So we think that, for example, studying these co-authorship networks, you can even see changes even in those people that you wouldn't see a change in the typical indices of success of a grant, which is publishing papers and having those papers cited. Of course, the major problem with this is that we don't have a control group, because you don't have access to data of those people that were rejected. You can look maybe for controls that are similar to them from the same institution, but there are even more biases related to choosing such controls. So one of the important things would be to get the data about grants. And this is, again, we could also see, for example, and this was interesting for me because I come from what is called countries with regard to research excellence. So we are lower research intensive countries like Croatia. And when you start, for example, there is no difference from kind of mature scientists, but when you're a startup grantee, when you come from a higher intensive research country in comparison to those that are coming from lower intensive countries, you develop, but you are much better off if you're in a bigger research community than in a small community, and you grow much more in your collaborative network than people that receive such grants in smaller countries. So what our message there was also that we also have to make transparent, like in medicine where we want the transparency of clinical trials, the data on the process of grant peer review should also be open to researchers. And then we also, not then, but it was before this study, in collaboration with the people from the European Commission, we got access to, as you see here, almost 25,000 proposals to Marie Curie Skłodowska actions in the FP7, where we wanted to see at the agreement of reviewers. You all know that the agreement is a problem. We in medicine usually say that we don't look for agreement because we want different people to look at the same thing, and we expect this agreement. There are studies that have calculated that you need at least 7 reviewers to reach some kind of agreement level that would be satisfactory for peer review. And we wanted to see how important this is in peer review, because I don't know if some of you have been to Marie Curie fellowship grants. You have 8,000 applications and you have to rank them, and the process is that all of these applications are reviewed externally and remotely by people, and then they all come. So you can imagine how many people have to come for 8,000 proposals in Brussels for a central consensus meeting when it is decided on the scoring and on the list. So we wanted to see whether this agreement already exists before they come to Brussels. So actually, the decision can be made already on the remote phase, so that there is no need for a central phase. So we looked at what is called a measure of average deviation index as a measure of inter-rated agreement of the 3 reviews of a grant. So we saw that when you look overall, generally, that there was a good general agreement among raters, and even for proposals when one rater disagreed with the others, or where all 3 raters disagreed, when you looked at their individual and consensus reports, these scores were still highly associated. And where we found this may be something for social sciences, humanities, this is where the disagreement was the largest. And also when you had more complex proposals like ITN, these are international training networks in comparison to fellowships, for example, which are kind of easier for people to agree. So we actually show on a large number of proposals on this big sample that agreement is already reached at the remote level, and that actually, this publication actually influenced the policy, because after communicating these results even before it was published, the European Commission decided that they are not going to spend like 8 million euros to bring people to Brussels to make a decision on a project where everybody said that it was either good or bad remotely. So most of the evaluation now in Marie Curie Sklodowska action is remote, because there is sufficient evidence that the agreement between reviewers is the same as if you would bring them to the central consensus process. But then again, for this we need more data on that. So I'm going, instead of a conclusion, I'm going to finish with this letter from the European Commission to a group of researchers that we got together after the cost action on peer review and said, okay, we also need data on grants. So we wrote them a letter asking European Commission to give us access to data. And this is the reply that came a few days ago, where they said they are analyzing historical data, they will make them available, and this legal provision is GDPR. And also, they're also thinking of how to open access to anonymized data for Horizon Europe. So I think, I wasn't at the session about the future of meta-research, but I think that we have a lot of opportunities that are opening now for us, at least in Europe, to study research in really good and methodologically rigorous way. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for taking us on a tour and reviewing all the reviewers. There's time for questions, debates, please.
Thank you for this talk. This was very interesting. One thing, the discrepancy you showed between essentially reviews where people put their names on and people they don't, it reminds me of an experience I have as an editor myself, which is the uncomfortable situation you sometimes come in when reviewers write confidential to the editor stuff like, this is an awful paper and should never be published. And then the review says, with some revisions, this may be suitable to... This makes me wonder, which of the two is the real one, right?
Exactly.
Because it's clear that they're different, but which one should we believe? Like because if it's true that the nasty one is the real one, then perhaps it's not such a good idea to move towards these open reviews, if you understand what I'm saying. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, I think we need more research on that, right. Definitely. Because with what we know, we really can't say which is the true person that is saying it. I think that probably when you don't have to identify yourself, or when your name doesn't have to be there, I think that's a truer one. Because as you saw, when the name gets published, that's a problem. It's not when what you say is being published. So you saw that you get the same results and same recommendations. On the other hand, as an editor, I would say, why should reviewers recommend anything? In medicine, we think that the editor is the one who makes a decision. We usually don't ask the reviewers for recommendation. We asked them to tell us about what they think about, different aspects of research, and then the editor is the one who makes a decision and then also has the responsibility for the decision. So very often in medical journals you wouldn't have a recommendation, but that still doesn't mean that that solves the problems of what people say openly and what they say when they don't have to disclose their name. I think it's an interesting kind of research direction that we can look into.
Right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm from the University of Bristol. So I gave a talk on this at a postgraduate conference and was talking about open science. And someone who works in computer science said that, I didn't do any further research into this, but so this is based purely on his own anecdote, but he said that open peer review had been an issue in his field because it just descended into criticism. And so instead of people being overly nice, people were overly critical as it was seen as a point scoring. And so I'm wondering if you think that open peer review is subject to kind of the culture in different fields, and like what kind of factors in that culture might mean that open review is effective or not.
Yeah, I mean, from the studies that we have in biomedicine, mostly in kind of clinical research, is that open peer review has the same quality because we have tools to kind of assess the quality of peer review, do they address all the important things and so on and so on. So the quality of open peer review versus the single blind review is the same, only people are more polite. That's the finding of open peer review in there. Again, it would be really interesting to see which of the open peer review models kind of works the best, because you, as I said, you can have everything published, you can have openness in a journal, but not, it's confidential, it's not open to the public, you can have only the reports published, but not the names, so it would be interesting to see how that works. Are there field differences, who use, this is quite a novel thing, so I think we are going to see more research into that in future.
Thank you. Given what you know, do you have given that you're like an expert, etc., what would you say is the best model? Or if you could say, okay, we need to test these 3, what would you say? And then the other part that I wondered, at some point you said that we would need 7 experts to agree, basically, at a level that would be legitimate for peer review. But then you went on to say that for the Marie Curie, it worked for 3 of them. So I wonder, do we need 7? Do you think 3 is enough?
I mean, if you're looking for agreement, you probably do, but if you're not looking for agreement, because, for example, in medicine, you can send the same paper to a surgeon and a pediatrician and an anesthesiologist who will all, or statistician, who will all give different views. And they don't have to agree because they will be looking at different things. As for your question about which model is best, I think there is no answer to that, and I think that almost every journal or discipline even, for example, in medicine or in kind of hard sciences, open peer review is fine because, we talk about numbers and data, whereas when you come to social science, especially to humanities, where it's, my interpretation of what I thought Aristotle said and what you think he thought when he wrote that, it's very subjective, and maybe their kind of blind peer review would be better. It is known, for example, that younger people, and they are perceived as the best reviewers, so research in biomedicine shows that the best reviewers are young academics. And they are the ones who wouldn't want to be open because, it's them against their professors or big shots in the field. So I think each field and each discipline or a journal needs to find the best way for them. In medicine, as I said, we are moving towards greater transparencies because of, especially in clinical research, because of the transparency of clinical research, results from clinical research, and the problems that we had with that transparency. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm still a bit confused about the open review. yet another question on open review. So the percentage of accepts goes up, you're saying, compared to blind, single blind, double blind review?
Yeah.
But
The recommendations of reviewers, it's not what the editor decides.
okay.
So this is the recommendation given by the peer reviewer in their report.
But then the quality remains the same. You say, so then I wonder how you measure quality, because if something really changes, then it's interesting what it means that the quality remains the same.
This wasn't about the quality, this study, where we saw differences, whether your name is published or not. They didn't look at the quality of peer review. The quality of peer review is measured by different things. For example, BMJ developed a assessment tool that you can go through, a peer review, editors go through peer review, and they kind of score peer review. Peer review report. And also I have seen it developed also more for social sciences in nursing, where they look at other aspects, because that one is for clinical research. So the question of recommendations and the quality here, it wasn't studied in the study that I showed on where their recommendations were different when their names were published.
Okay,
But there are ways how to assess the quality of peer review.
Yeah, I mean, my hunch would be that the quality in terms of what is the percentage of papers that other people think are not good papers that get accepted would go up. But, I mean, I'm not sure. I would like to see that, if that could be measured.
Okay, I have one final, somewhat leading question.
Okay.
The leading question is that, depending on how you define the academic world and the academic publishing landscape, science publishes what, 1.3 million to 3 million articles a year, most of which, I guess, although we're not always clear about this, are subjected to peer review. Do you consider, having shared with us your knowledge about the research on peer review, that we have done enough to investigate peer review?
No.
Okay, so that was the leading question, which also brings me to a close. There's another session on this that you will be sent in parallel sessions. There is also, so that's how can meta-research improve peer review here on the first floor in CZ9. CZ8, how can meta-research improve the psychological science accelerator, and how can the PSA improve meta-research? How can, that's in CZ8 here, how can meta-research improve our understanding of the effect of incentives on the efficiency and reliability of science? Upstairs, CZ109. And D, that's the fourth one in CZ108, upstairs again, many paths, a new way to communicate, discuss, and conduct meta-research. This will be the parallel sessions. They will start in 28 minutes. Public service announcement, lost and found, or the stuff that we found, somehow lost by one of you or multiple people of you. They're at the reception area there. We now have a break and reconvene here in the main hall with Johnny and Iris' talk. Thank you, and thanks Anna again.